Welcome to the Modern Mexico Podcast. I'm your host, Nathaniel Parish. On today's episode of the podcast, we're talking about Mexican cycling phenomenon Isaac Del Toro, a cyclist who captured the world's attention this year. We're also delving into the topic of how sports have helped shape and develop modern Mexico's identity. And we're also looking at how Mexico's current social and political context have impacted the country's athletes. I think that within the world of sports, Isaac Del Toro is absolutely Mexico's top star right now. And this year I had the chance to travel to Italy to watch Del Toro compete at the Giro d'Italia, Italy's biggest pro cycling race. I was totally amazed to get to watch him compete in the race leader's pink jersey. He almost won the whole Giro and ultimately walked away with a second place finish and a stage win. TNT Sports covered Isaac's achievements live.
In the pink jersey, 8 days. Is he the leader? Was he the leader? He certainly is now, and he's going to be more the Giro leader after this. He's in the race. He's alive. Viva Mexico! Viva el Giro! Viva Isaac Del Toro! Maglia Rosa, stage winner, and now increasing his lead.
Del Toro is now regarded as one of the best young cyclists in the world. He won 21 professional races before turning 21. I interviewed him in Mexico City in 2023 after he won the Tour l'Avenir in France and signed a contract with the UAE Emirates pro cycling team. I interviewed him again at length a few months ago and wrote an article about his experience at the Giro d'Italia for the British cycling magazine ROULEUR. I talked to him in Italy after he finished his historic first day wearing the Maglia Rosa, something no other Mexican cyclist had ever done before. He said it was like a dream that he still couldn't believe. Isaac told me that he started working towards being a serious athlete when he was in elementary school. He prioritized his diet and trained riding up the hill behind his parents' house. He found success early and competed in races in Mexico and in the US, and he also raced in Mexico's national championship at age 14. But his achievements in 2025 have also sparked a broader debate in Mexico about the politics of sports and whether Mexico's government is doing enough to support its top athletes. Isaac Del Toro's father publicly criticized Mexico's government for trying to take credit for his son's success.
José Del Toro arremetió contra el director de la CONADE, Rommel Pacheco, el padre del primer mexicano en la historia en conseguir el segundo lugar en el Giro de Italia. No está conforme con la propaganda que afirma que Isaac Del Toro recibe apoyo institucional.
Del Toro's father complained that as a teenage cycling star, Del Toro often competed in major races on shoddy bikes. He also said that Isaac Del Toro had once gone hungry while traveling to compete. So today we're doing a deep dive into Isaac Del Toro's story and looking at what it tells us about modern Mexico. On today's podcast, we're speaking to David Wysocki, a Mexican-focused historian who has written about the history of sports in Mexico. Hi, David. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nathaniel.
So I wanted to start off by asking you about this news story where Isaac Del Toro's father voiced some of his frustrations with Mexico's government taking credit for Isaac Del Toro's success. And I'm wondering what that incident tells us about the role of sports in Mexico.
Yeah, great question to start us off. Well, Del Toro's experience is a pretty common one, I would say. His father's essentially upset that CONADE, the sports federation in Mexico, is taking credit for his success by saying he was a product of Mexico's sporting system. He's obviously expressing frustration that they would do this, considering that he feels like his son was not supported at all. And it's likely 100% true and valid, by the way. It's a super common problem that I've heard from top athletes in the country for a decade. And I know that it's a problem that is much older than that. And it doesn't just impact players in individual sports. I've heard similar stories from national teams as well, even stories of uneven funding for events where national teams are competing and representing the country. Athletes who live near the borders or have opportunities to go elsewhere, something like dual citizenship, etc. They very often take advantage of those opportunities for this reason. And I would say sports in the last 30 years or more, until Lopez Obrador, has become very focused on spectacle and less on the development of good people or citizens, and that has really followed neoliberalism, I would say. That's a trend that's followed in almost every country. Now, taking a step back, historically, sports in Mexico had a very different character. From the beginning of the century, there was a lot of belief in the social developmental benefits of mass sports participation in the same way that you saw sports promoted in socialist countries. The government cared significantly in those years about the development of athletes. It was considered an important tool for social and eugenic engineering in the eyes of scientists, and I'll explain a little more later maybe what that means. And those ideas had a lot of support in every ministry building in Mexico City in the face of the country's ongoing struggle with what leaders have historically referred to as the Indian problem, or the perceived backwardness, unhealthiness, immorality that officials often believe came from the country's indigenous background and active indigenous communities, of course, too. Of course, they blamed almost all of the country's problems on the Indian problem, and it's been used to justify uneven development around the country, historically speaking. So sports investment much later became a tool for showing off Mexico's arrival to the modern world. That's maybe like the 1950s to the 80s, by its readiness to host and succeed in international competition, culminating, of course, in the hosting of the Olympics in 1968. And since then, it's been definitively more symbolic, with sports federations being chronically underfunded, leaving Mexico's best athletes holding the bag, so to speak. But since AMLO, of course, as mentioned before, there's been a spoken commitment to turn back the clock, invest more in physical education as a way to sort of uplift the citizenry. But it came really in the face of a lot of significant budget cuts around the government, and also for the actual sports federations, which may have worsened the situation in some ways. And of course, with Mexico's constant bureaucratic turnover with every administration, it's made things kind of chaotic. Funding's hard to come by and can't really be counted on. Policies and functionaries often all change every presidential cycle.
So I do think it's interesting to hear you say that some of Isaac Del Toro's father's complaints are a common trend that you might hear from the families of top athletes in Mexico. And I think there is one concept that might be helpful for explaining what's going on in the background here. And that is the idea of limited government resources. We know that as recently as the year 2000, Mexico's tax revenue only added up to around 9% of its GDP. And that figure has increased since then, and it is better than it was 2 decades ago, but it's still a lot lower than the level of tax collection in the US and in many other countries. Right now, Mexico's tax take as a percentage of GDP is less than half of what Canada or Italy collect. And in general, it's important to understand that modern Mexico has very high levels of off-the-books, informal economic activity, and there's a limited government presence in many rural regions. So I do think that this idea that there are limited government resources and that politicians in Mexico need to make tough decisions is important to keep in mind when it comes to debates about the public funding of sports in Mexico. There does seem to be a fundamental question here, and That is, should the budget for athletes be concentrated in developing champions and medal winners, or should it be spread out to build basketball courts and outdoor gyms and parks in a wide array of communities around the country? And with that in mind, I wanted to ask, over the past 100 years, what role have sports really played in the formation of the modern Mexican state?
Yeah, so it really depends who you ask. And of course, it depends on the perspective of if you're talking about like an official's perspective or an athlete's perspective. I'm sure they're not going to have maybe deep thoughts on state formation as it relates to their participation in sports. But I'll go into the way that the government has approached this. So since the 1890s, the state's military leaders wanted to employ sport to really shape up what they saw as a lazy, backward society, bottom line. But nothing brought, in their minds, together disparate folks together better than working together on a team and working in military service. Of course, this is a common idea about military service. Military leaders, they naturally saw sport as a substitute for military service since it promoted a lot of the same lessons on teams. From their view, it was kind of a perfect nation building tool. You get these mestizos, these indigenous and white folks playing together, learning discipline, sacrifice, learn how to lose with grace and dignity, but of course, never give up. They believed it would harden their citizens. That they thought that or that thought really carried from the 1880s through the 1940s. And every president in that time came from a military background, and every one of them was a deportista in their youth. Now, if you're talking about from the perspective of companies, I know this is not state building exactly, but they use sports as a method of increasing physical health and controlling their workers, believing that if they were playing baseball, they would not be drinking or mingling with sex workers as much. They often work with unions and the federal government to promote sports development and tied messages of sporting habits with socialism and patriotism. That's especially true during the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas. Now, public health and education leaders are an interesting side case, but they felt sports taught teamwork and promoted healthy socialization and hygiene habits, but it was also a conductor for science into a space of perceived mysticism and magical thinking. And that's the way they thought of predominantly indigenous communities. Missionaries that were sometimes 17 or 18-year-old boys and girls from Mexico City, fresh out of school, often would go into the countryside to literally lecture campesinos, farmers, about science and sports, which, as you can imagine, didn't really land well often. But leading scientists and public health officials and presidents often bonded public health campaigns to sporting festivals and parades featuring athletes seemingly all the time into the 1950s. There was a cutting edge science. Some will now say pseudoscience, but I want to be clear, it was taken very seriously at the time by many of the most influential thinkers in the world. And that was the eugenic component of all of this. Eugenics, of course, being a form of race science, and there were two main branches of it. There was Mendelian eugenics, which posited that genes were passed on more or less uniformly, and the outcome of the offspring was almost inevitable, or at least that's the way many world leaders thought of it. And this was the most commonly accepted version by the Western world. Of course, leaders that then judged poverty, perceived backwardness, etc., as evidence of bad genes. And this led to the thinking that people of color were in the low state they were in because of bad genes, and therefore there was justification to pursue policies of elimination rather than building up social safety nets. Of course, you have the German and US examples, genocide and sterilization efforts, respectively. But in Mexico, the science was very disconcerting. It meant that the future was already written. Even Jose Vasconcelos, author of The Cosmic Race, seem to believe this version, especially later in life. Now, most intellectuals and public leaders, like those in the Soviet Union and Brazil, latched onto a different eugenic idea called neo-Lamarckian eugenics. And this idea emphasized the ability for one to change one's own genetic path with changes in their daily life and habits. Both versions of genetics have some truth to them in the end, but this led to a promotion of sports as a way of literally racially engineering new citizens. And officials made that connection very overt in the 1920s and 1930s. The government sponsored thousands of parties, events, parades centering sports and science and tying sports to patriotic molding of a new race, not just in spirit. Always full of music, speeches, and barbecue. Of course, indigenous and rural communities, already distrusting of the government, would often come for the excitement and often didn't really care to listen to any of the speeches. But it was a place to be, to see and to be seen, meet girls and boys, have a party, and of course, to play sports. And I want to emphasize an important point, though. Both eugenic ideas still operated with the assumption that the Indian problem was very real. The neo-Lamarckian approach was a little less violent, but it also was built on the premise that indigenous and mixed race people were defective. So indigenous communities did have a different relationship with sport than the government. Oftentimes, many did embrace the Cardenista sporting programs. But there was a long history of using sports in defiance of Mexico City. And even today in Oaxaca and Chiapas, for example, there are sort of these rebel baseball leagues that refuse support and affiliation from the capital. Some tie baseball roots in ancient Mexican games like Pelota Mixteca. Some communities in Yucatan use sport to organize politically. They've even been adopted, or different regions have adopted different origin stories of sports. For example, in Yucatan, players believe baseball came from Cuba and not the US or Mexico City, and there's actually some evidence for that. And in most places these days, sport shows up, I would say, primarily in the American way. It's a spectacle, and typically fans are drawn to the flash and awe of the production, and of course, the money. Boxers are a great example of this and have been since the 40s and the 50s. But in baseball and soccer, who have affiliated development programs that are run and financed by private entities, have built really nice pipelines actually for development.
So I know when I was reading your paper, I really found it to be absolutely fascinating to get the chance to look at different eras of Mexican history in the last 100 years through the lens of sports and the way different presidents promoted sports. And I know that you mentioned that in the 1930s, President Cardenas did try to promote some ultra long distance cycling races, but you also explained that some of the cyclists complained that they were not able to finish because of lack of funding. And one idea from your paper seems to be that Mexico has made some perfunctory efforts over the years at preparing athletes to compete in events like the Olympics. But for most of the past century, Mexico's presidents have really focused much of their effort in the area of sports on what we might call community development initiatives. And I did think it was really fascinating to think about what Mexico was really like 100 years ago. And I think it's important to note that it was a country where the politicians in Mexico City really had only a tenuous amount of connection with many far-flung rural communities. And I think that that's important to remember because with the population spread out over such a large territory, it's really tough to create world-class athletic training facilities in every town. And you mention in the paper a car race that Mexico hosted that covered 2,200 miles and ran from the northern border in Chihuahua all the way down to the southern border in Chiapas. And at the time, it was the longest car race in the world. And I think it's important that we remember how big Mexico is and how spread out the population continues to be. Um, Mexico is a landmass that's almost exactly the same size as Europe, and a very large segment of the population continues to live in quite small mountain towns. And Baja California, the state where Isaac Del Toro is from, has a population that's a little bit smaller than the state of Utah in the US, but Baja California has over 660 middle schools, which is almost 4 times as many as Utah has. And Isaac told me that he never attended a school in Mexico that had a weight room, and he didn't start doing any type of strength training until he joined the AR Monarch cycling team in 2019. And we know that more generally, Mexico spends the least per student on education of all of the countries in the OECD. So, challenges with the quality and availability of infrastructure at schools, including athletic facilities, continues to be an overall trend in Mexico. And I did think it was really fascinating to read about and think about how the construction of sports facilities at schools really was an essential part of Mexico's 20th century nation building efforts. And in many cases, it sounded like the teachers who worked for the federal public education ministry were often the first point of contact many remote communities had with the Mexican government in Mexico City. And I thought it was fascinating to read about how sports, including baseball and basketball, were used to create a common culture that extended beyond individual communities. And we do see that Mexico has, made some progress in sports. I remember you explained that a century ago they won a early medal in basketball, but more recently they've had more success in individual sports. And at the 2024 Olympics, Mexico won medals in boxing, archery, diving, and judo. And many sports fans and academics have looked at this fact that Mexican athletes who do find success often seem to be people who compete in individual sports. And there are two books that I thought might be helpful for exploring this question. And they are Jorge Castañeda's Mañana Forever and Darren Acemoglu's Why Nations Fail. And I have two clips from those that I can share. Here's Jorge Castañeda talking about Mexico's culture.
Is Mexico's radical, extreme individualism, which may be a bit counterintuitive if you remember what you've seen in the murals and what you've read and you've seen in the movies and stuff of Mexico as a collective people, a people where everything is done together. No, we do nothing together. You cannot find two Mexicans who will cooperate on anything. Zip, nothing, absolutely nothing. Mexicans are far more individualistic and far less associative, collective than Americans certainly, but than most Latin Americans also.
And here's a clip from Why Nations Fail.
The reason that Nogales, Arizona is much richer than Nogales, Sonora is simple. It is because of the very different institutions on the two sides of the border, which create very different incentives for the inhabitants of Nogales, Arizona versus Nogales, Sonora. The United States is also far richer today than either Mexico or Peru because of the way its institutions, both economic and political, shape the incentives of businesses, individuals, and politicians. Each society functions with a set of economic and political rules created and enforced by the state and the citizens collectively. Economic institutions shape economic incentives, the incentives to become educated, to save and invest, to innovate and adopt new technologies, and so on. It is the political process that determines what economic institutions people live under, and it is the political institutions that determine how this process works.
Mañana Forever makes an argument about Mexico's national character and the role of the characteristic of individualism. And Acemoglu, on the other hand, argues that it's all about institutions. And he writes that countries with concentrated economic and political power will develop institutions that discourage or limit widespread success or prosperity. And I'm wondering, what's your view on the individualism versus institutions debate? Which argument do you find more convincing in explaining the paucity of great Mexican athletes?
I'm definitely more persuaded by an institutional explanation of this. In the case of sports, there are so many great athletes that just can't afford to develop. That's just the reality. Not because they don't have the drive, not because of any other reason other than they just lack money. And not just money to pay for training, but also to eat well, to to just have freedom, but money to just keep them out of regular jobs and manual labor. The system, as is, inherently rewards a certain social class of player. Plus, funding cuts in the past have turned Mexican sports attention sort of inward back toward the capital, which also makes development more difficult, especially if you're in an economically depressed region, right? If you're an amazing campesino basketball player, odds are pretty long that you're going to get the opportunity to develop and get funding. But we should point out that Mexico does have a long history of producing top athletes. There's Vinny Castilla, of course, Del Toro, Joaquin Capilla, Pilar Rodon, Fernando Valenzuela, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, plus a bunch of great soccer players. If the question is about individuals rising instead of national teams, well, the circumstances of the individual often helps make that determination. Family means professional scout, closeness to professional scouting, etc. And it's easier to fund an individual than it is for a whole team. But going back to the question, I just don't think the assertion of the culture of individualism as being a rooted thing in Mexico is even really necessarily true. Individualism, especially expressed through voting, union participation, informal economy, etc. To me, it's about survival. And Mexicans, like many people, are pragmatic. And collectivism in these examples is denied only because it doesn't benefit people. Political participation is low, for example, because people don't trust their leadership, and corruption maybe. They don't participate in unions because they've been co-opted by that same government. They participate in informal economy not because they don't value the security of formalism, but that the barriers to entry are so high and potentially corruption. That's a perception. And I want to say that that's not always reality. There were so many amazing promoters of sport in the sporting case now and in the past that have squeezed every ounce of juice out of the sporting fruit to keep these programs alive. But there's a perception that CONADE and some of these other organizations are not stable and possibly could be corrupt. And there's a very obvious windfall in terms of financing. So again, my position is that expressions of extreme individualism are often folks facing something broken, corrupt, often empty. And Mexicans are communally minded people when it serves them. And there's great historical examples of this. If you look at sports infrastructure and development, really everyone wanted mass participation of sports to succeed. Military leaders, health officials, educators, campesinos. They didn't always agree on why sports were important, but they always wanted it. And in terms of the state-led project, you can look at the Cardenas years in the first real effort at mass participation of sports, even in the furthest reaches of the country. Departments were formed, normal schools opened, fallow lands from old haciendas were granted for the building of sports facilities, federations organized. But what happened in rural communities? Well, they took the same route for development they took with rural schools. The federal government would provide the instruction and send out the experts, but local communities had to largely build the facilities on their own with maybe some promise of partial funding or a promise of an attached infrastructure project like a new road. A lot of communities, though, faced this reality. There was not enough equipment to develop the land. There was not enough know-how to create or play certain sports. There was a lack of running water in many of these communities for drinking, let alone taking showers and practicing good hygiene. Old ruling families who had some of these haciendas challenged government seizures of lands that were earmarked for sports fields or tying them up in court for years until the next administration. Fields were being built, but sometimes 5 miles from where anybody lives. There were no balls or basic equipment at some moments, and in places, kids didn't even wear shoes yet, or at that time. So there was definitely a disconnect between Mexico City and the realities of what some of these communities were facing. Yet you still have these instances, thousands of letters written to Lázaro Cárdenas, for example, personal letters asking for things like baseballs or two, so that their community could show him how dedicated they are to the cause. I don't think that's insignificant. The government didn't have the resources to do what they wanted with sports to its fullest extent, and the country was still not developed enough probably to do it. And the lack of more success of top athletes historically is really a result of lack of resources to support mass participation, in my opinion. There's claims of corruption, but there's also just not much in terms of resources to start with, and very few people in the country are well enough to pass off work or family obligations to dedicate their life completely to a sport. But to highlight the greater point, in Mexico today, we're seeing a massive recent wave of elite talent in both soccer and baseball emerging because of professional organizations, mostly led by very wealthy individuals who have built academies and world-class training centers to develop players in these sports. You can look at Alfredo Harpelu, who's on the Diablos Rojos and the Guerreros and Oaxaca baseball teams. He's a cousin of Carlos Slim. He also owns a part of the San Diego Padres. He's built amazing facilities around the country, and they're producing top global talent. So the problem to me is not motivation or culture or genetics or whatever someone might say. It's about money. And big picture, I would say it's difficult to characterize sports development in Mexico as a success or a failure in light of all of this. And really, that's not what's most important about the Mexican sports story, in my opinion. The story is just a fantastic way of seeing how the federal government works and how regular people experience it and where they connect and disconnect, the attitudes those in charge have of the countryside and vice versa. The promises of the revolution were never really fully realized, and the people feel it every day. And sports, I think, can sometimes serve as a mirror of society, and I think it does in this case as well.
Yeah, definitely. I do think that this debate of individualism versus institutions is, helpful for understanding the situation of particular athletes, but also very helpful for thinking about the broader picture about sports in Mexico. And I know that Castaneda mentions the parable of crabs in a bucket not wanting to see each other succeed, and he cites the personality trait of individualism as a primary driver of why Mexico's sporting success has mostly come in individual sports such as boxing, archery, and now cycling. But I'm really not sure that I find that argument very convincing. So I think I'm inclined to agree with you that institutions probably play a much bigger role in shaping outcomes than any sense of national character. We know that overall, Mexico is really defined by the incredible concentration of economic and political power. And it's home to a handful of billionaires and millions of low-income residents. And in a context of weak rule of law, two types of businesses thrive: powerful, politically connected monopolies and small, independent, informal businesses. And I think that the why nations fail argument looks at how institutions develop in a context of concentrated political and economic power. And it's really not surprising that Mexico's schools and athletic facilities are chronically underfunded and ill-prepared based on the overall context in Mexico. And I do think that this institutional critique is much more helpful in understanding why Mexico produces so few top athletes in general. And it's also helpful to look at institutions and ascribe some blame to the institutional context versus blaming the lack of success on some type of personality quirk that many Mexicans might share. And one other question I have is, when we look at the context in Mexico, are you seeing any new developments during the Cuatro T era of López Obrador and Claudia Sheinbaum that are changing the way that sports are promoted in Mexico?
Yeah, and at least, what they're saying is definitely um, indicative of change, and they seem to be putting some money behind it as well. There's been an interesting turn back to the people, I would say, back to mass participation, at least in theory, which is very on brand for somebody like Lopez Obrador. Image building sports, spectacle sports, they've kind of been repositioned as an elitist pastime, kind of how they were in the 1920s and the 1930s. But of course, mass participation brings wider social benefits for health and character development if you're of that mind. Um, Lopez Obrador also has been sort of disruptive in the sense that he's distrusting of the federations, the sports federations, and the sporting infrastructure that's been built over the last 100 years in Mexico. Of course, there was a corruption scandal about a decade ago, and there's still a widespread idea among athletes, as I mentioned earlier, that there's corruption in the system itself. But there's new money or new infrastructure being built. There's new infrastructure to move money directly to athletes and go around the federations. There's a lot of debate around if this is a good thing or a bad thing for sports development. Some people see it as making the situation worse. Some people think it's better for developing top flight athletes when they're identified. So results, I would say, at this point are sort of unknown, but it would be surprising if the tide didn't turn back with future new administrations, I would say. Although Scheinbaum is, just like Lopez Obrador, is very committed to sports. It seems, I think 2 weeks ago, at the time of this recording, Scheinbaum awarded the National Sports Award to Del Toro, and a bunch of other athletes as well, and announced some new investments in sports. So I think, as long as they can avoid kind of resetting the deck with a new administration and kind of are committed to mass participation, I think that these new investments, this new focus on physical education and sports in Mexico could actually bring a lot of great benefit for the development of all athletes in Mexico.
Definitely. So I definitely do think it's important to notice and take note of the fact that both Lopez Obrador and Scheinbaum have made some interesting new efforts in the area of sports. And I know that former President Lopez Obrador made promoting baseball a major focus, and he spent over $200 million on programs and facilities. And Scheinbaum has also done some interesting things. I know that she hosted a massive boxing class in Mexico City's Zocalo, and she also launched a nationwide program to build soccer facilities and promote soccer ahead of the 2026 World Cup. And um, on a more individual level, Obrador also played baseball frequently while in office and was often, photographed or appeared in videos in the news playing baseball. And Scheinbaum, while she was mayor of Mexico City, rode a bike to promote a new bike lane. And in general, she worked pretty frequently to promote cycling. And I also think just looking at Mexico City over the last 20 years, politicians have invested a lot in building outdoor gyms and basketball courts all over the city. And Mexico City was also an early adopter of bike sharing programs. Uh, it did a lot of work to create bike lanes and also was an innovator in creating a car-free circuit for cyclists to ride every Sunday. And in particular, I think the Sunday Cicloton bike ride is a major success story for helping promote physical activity. And I know that around 100,000 people participate in the Sunday bike ride every weekend in Mexico City. But overall, with that in mind, it does seem like there hasn't been necessarily a paradigm shift away from that Cardenas era model. And it does seem like Mexico's focus with sports continues to be more about promoting public health and community development rather than maximizing individual performance and winning more Olympic medals or championships. But I do think that at the end of the day, these efforts may end up helping develop more top athletes too. I think that people only ever really find out if they have athletic talent, if they have a chance to start playing a sport, start training, start competing. And I have heard stories about pro cyclists who find, tremendous success, who started cycling and training at a late age in their late teens or early 20s. So, I do think that overall having more programs and new facilities and communities across Mexico should develop a broader base of young athletes in Mexico. But there's a question about, how many of those young athletes will have the chance to really compete at the highest level in the world. And to close out the discussion, I just wanted to ask, how significant are Isaac Del Toro's achievements this year? Is there any precedent that you can think of a Mexican athlete achieving this level of global recognition?
That's a great question, and it's a little bit difficult to answer from a global perspective. His achievements, let me just start by saying his achievements are extremely significant, especially considering the sport he's participating in, which, Mexico tended to not have great presence in before, or at least not for a very long time. And he broke through in a way very similar to Fernando Valenzuela did in baseball. And that's the one hesitation I have in saying that he is the most recognized um, athlete from Mexico for his achievements in his sport, just because baseball is so popular. And Fernando Mania was like a real crazy thing that happened for many years in the 1980s. Especially for not just in Mexico, but for the Mexican diaspora as well. But I think that's not at all to downplay anything Del Toro has done. And in many ways, I think Del Toro is positioned to do a lot more, especially in terms of individual achievement in his sport. He's up there with the greatest impact or, disruption ever in sport, and his story is incredible. Um, and as opposed to Fernando Valenzuela, who was a baseball player, and there's a deep history of baseball in Mexico. You can't really say the same for necessarily for cycling, although cycling is very underrated in Mexico.
Yeah, so I do know there are a number of great Mexican athletes who have certainly gained a very prominent role on the global stage over the last few decades. And um, someone who might come to mind is the boxer Canelo Alvarez, who achieved some remarkable success and really captured the world's attention for being a superstar. But that being said, as you mentioned, within the particular context of Mexico's role in cycling, it seems like Isaac Del Toro has the chance to do something very special. And I went back and looked at the records from the 1968 Olympics, and there actually were a few Mexican cyclists in 68 who did okay, who they weren't on the podium, they weren't in the top 10, but they also weren't, finishing in last place. So there does seem to be some history of cycling in Mexico, and at the amateur level, there does seem to be a lot of activity, especially with, older amateur cyclists racing in different states across the country. But in terms of a young pro cyclist making a big impact in the pro circuit, this does seem to be pretty incredible. And we know that the first time that a Mexican cyclist rode in the Giro d'Italia was in 1990. And the last time that a Mexican cyclist won a stage at the Giro, Isaac Del Toro wasn't even born yet. So um, it does seem pretty significant to see this young cyclist not just competing, not just winning one particular day, but nearly winning the entire Giro d'Italia and, going on to win several other pro races by the end of the year and really cementing himself as one of, if not the top up and coming young cyclist in the world. And I do think that cycling has this very unique connection to the geography of the countries where the competitions take place and the countries where the cyclists grew up training. And Isaac Del Toro has ridden and trained in the mountains near Mexico City in Valle de Bravo, Navarro de Toluca, and in El Desierto de los Leones. And in 2026, Del Toro will race in the Tour de France, and amateur cyclists and cycling fans will get the chance to, watch a cyclist who trained on these roads in Mexico riding in the Tour de France. And that will be a pretty incredible moment for Mexico. But at the same time, amateur cyclists in Mexico are going to have the chance to compete in a road race in Del Toro's home state, which is organized by L'Etape, the group that organizes the Tour de France. And today we're talking about what impact Mexico's sports culture has had on Isaac Del Toro, but moving forward, I wonder if we're going to be able to talk about Del Toro's impact on Mexico. And if he continues to win, I think that he has the chance to inspire a new generation of Mexican cyclists. And at the same time, if he continues to attract attention to cycling, I wonder what changes will happen at the institutional level in terms of the development of youth racing teams and major cycling competitions. Will Mexico start promoting its own version of the Tour de France or the Giro d'Italia? There are a lot of questions, but it does seem like Isaac Del Toro has the chance to continue to gather a lot of attention for what he achieves on the bike, and those achievements might translate into some institutional changes in Mexico. But overall, I just want to say it was super interesting to hear your perspective today, and that I really enjoyed getting the chance to read your paper and seeing Mexico's history through the lens of sports. And just one more time, I want to say thanks so much for joining us on the Modern Mexico podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to take a short break to remind listeners that I'm always interested in connecting with executives and entrepreneurs who are trying to understand modern Mexico. I'm available to provide custom briefings on politics, public policy issues, and security problems in different parts of Mexico. So if you're interested in speaking to me, please don't hesitate to reach out. If you like what you heard on the podcast today, check out my book, Searching for Modern Mexico, which is available on Amazon. The next episode of the podcast is coming soon. Until then, hasta luego, amigos.